Saying everything I had to say about TSR Gary was almost painful. While I am not a member of the Church of Gygax as many are, I always liked the legend of him and was saddened when all my research suggested that it was exactly that, a legend built around a fallible human being. I still, in spite of that, like Gary Gygax. I smile at the mental image created by one writer who looked into what the FBI said about Gary Gygax, which is, he is a badass. After filing a Freedom of Information Act inquiry, it came to light that, thanks to, of all things, a search for the Unabomber in the mid-90s, that the FBI determined that wargamers are highly intelligent, though also that they were not neat of appearance and frequently overweight. It amusingly includes theories that the incompetent takeover of SPI by TSR was a calculated move to eliminate a pillar of the community. But anyway, it was thought that the Unabomber was a gamer, and after consideration decided approaching Gygax for help would be a mistake, that he would be, quote, extremely uncooperative. He is then described as eccentric and frightening, that he carries a gun, is a member of the Libertarian Party, has a Liberian account for tax purposes, and is proud of the fact that he personally answered any letter coming from a prison, and as established, is not a narc. It does, to me anyway, paint Gygax as a kind of late 20th century Americana fable, along the lines of Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan, that he's an even more amazing person. If I want to think about Gary Gygax, that's the image that I want. Gary Badass Gygax, playing Avalon Hill games on his front porch with his boots propped up on a chair and a wheel gun in his shoulder holster, the dragon in retirement at his Madison Street home in Lake Geneva. So to reiterate, yes, it was painful to have to say everything that I did say about TSR Gary, given this mental image that I had of him. But yet, I did have to, because if we didn't knock the pegs out from under him, the legend would make him a martyr, his victims his jealous rivals, and his vanquisher into a master villain. Those people were not dealing with a legend. They were dealing with a man who at this time was petty, vindictive, and self-serving. His legend had to be cast aside if we wanted to have as true of an accounting as we could of what actually happened. And this must also be true of Lorraine Williams. As you can imagine, the D&D audience were with St. Gary, and Gygax, well, you saw how the man was a sore winner. Just imagine how he acts when he loses. His portrait of Lorraine Williams is very, very unflattering, stating that she hates gamers. Except there's nothing to actually back this up. Only the word of a man who, it is demonstrably provable, is a self-serving liar. One clear-cut example was when he said that while Brian and Kevin were around, that he was helpless to oppose them because of their control. Yet, as I pointed out previously, when Kevin Bloom stated that the three of them were a triumvirate that ran TSR, being the three members of the board, Gygax issued a correction to make sure everybody understood he was at the top, Brian was below him, and Kevin below him, adding that Kevin had the dirty end of the stick. Nor does this mean that Gygax was chief of day-to-day operations. The reason Kevin had the dirty end of the stick was because that was his job. So when Gygax also says of Lorraine Williams, about him suggesting allowing the staff to buy shares, replying to him, over my dead body, it's hard to believe that, considering that when he was running the company, he was denying shares they were obligated to sell. More on that in a minute. Not to mention such shares would reduce his thin control of TSR to below 50% before long, something that he clearly would not tolerate. Any view of Lorraine Williams that originates with Gygax for these reasons should be considered highly suspect. This is very hard. But whenever I think of Lorraine Williams, an image that comes to my mind is that of the villainous owner of the Cleveland Indians in the film Major League, and how in the original cut she was eventually revealed to actually be a very sharp businesswoman who was doing Moneyball before there was any such thing as Moneyball. The movie makes so much more sense if she has a list of diamond-in-the-rough players rather than those with no ability whatsoever. But that was excised because test audiences didn't want that. They wanted a villain. They wanted her to be in the wrong and then vanquished. If after this you decide that Lorraine Williams is a villain, then that's fine. But I hope it is because of what she did and not because people have already decided what she is and used the rest to justify themselves. After all, if you're willing to give the benefit of the doubt to a man who was a cocaine-snorting, gun-carrying adulterer who hounded his partner out the door just because he co-created Dungeons & Dragons, then we should probably at least give a fair hearing to the woman who saved Dungeons & Dragons. Because as unpleasant as that is to consider, it's the truth. TSR, and thus D&D, lived to fight another day because she knew how to bring it back from the brink and actually put her money where her mouth was. And it was a lot of money. During the era when the Blooms were in control, they had the stock price revalued to $3,000 a share each. There are several reasons to do that, one being political, make it more difficult for minority shareholders to potentially squeeze them out, like Gygax eventually would. It also better reflected the value of TSR when they were working with other institutions, like, say, banks. But this led to a problem, the aforementioned screwing people out of their stocks. Will Niebling, you might recall, was part of the Blooms' downfall because he sued them and it brought things to light. He had a contract that included a 10-year option to buy 500 shares of TSR at $125 per share. Now that the stock was valued at $3,000, plus the potential threat that such an influx of new stock could pose, the Blooms decided no. Hence the lawsuit, which was finally settled 2 years after Gygax and the Blooms had left TSR, which was still stuck litigating their bad decisions. Well, in court, the jury said that Niebling had been denied what he was contractually obligated to, and TSR had to pay for the Blooms' jackassery. So, because he was denied the $2,875 per share profit that he should have gotten, the jury said he needed to be justly compensated, which works out to $1,437,500. You can see why I remain highly skeptical that Williams' arrival was the cause of TSR problems when it was being run by someone who wouldn't come to life or death bank meetings and the Marx Brothers. Williams has very, very rarely consented to interviews related to her time at TSR, but from everything I've read of first-hand interactions with her, the picture emerges of a woman who is not a saint, but is not a villain either. If Gygax ran the company like the dictator of a banana republic, Williams ran the company like a 12th century queen. She was snobbish, detested poachers, and preferred yes-men, but was sharp enough to recognize that if there was someone who spotted mistakes and was usually right, they were probably worth listening to. And she wanted to protect her subjects. She was prideful, but she was smart. Let's also throw out another accusation before we put two in the head and leave it in the grave. The accusation her hatred of gamers made her want to turn the company into something else. One thing brought up by a friend of Arneson who claims he met her at a shareholder meeting to prove this is branching out TSR into failed efforts like needlepoint and wood-burning kits. As you might have guessed, these are among the idiot ideas explored under the Blooms, but is now being attributed to Williams. Perpetuation of lies like these are why, if I seem to be defending Williams after attacking Gygax, it's only because when I see the deck stacked, I take issue. If you've ever been in a position where every mistake and unpopular choice is laid at your feet regardless of your role in it, of suffering character assassination from every side for being an outsider, then you understand why upon seeing that, you might feel compelled to resist the cries of angry mobs and speak out the way that you wish others might have spoken out for you. I'll be frank, Williams is going to fly this plane called TSR into the side of a mountain. But it's arguable that if she had hated gamers as much as people said, she might have missed it. How's that for irony? If only you had the character flaw you were accused of, the day could have been saved. Finally, the point about protecting your subjects. There was the case of an employee whose wife was having problems. Her mental state was deteriorating, and it reached a point where it was interfering too much with his work. He went to Williams to resign. She wouldn't hear of it. Take days off when you have to, work from home when you have to, leave the office when you have to, work your schedule as much as you can, and let your team know so that they can pick up the slack. He never even got a pay cut for that. Bruce Hurd, an employee under both Gygax and Williams, defended her when one of Arneson's friends hopped into a comment section and threw accusations against Williams. Hurd, besides noting that Williams wasn't exactly the only prima donna he had to endure while surrounded by creatives, said, quote, "She respected those who showed talent and pulled their share, even though her manner lacked elegance to say the least." There would be a time when there would have to be layoffs, and one of her senior managers, one who had refused to be a yes man and was usually right, told her that she'd let go two of his most irreplaceable employees. She reflected on that, and then did something that must have been hard. She went back and told him, "I made a mistake. I should have known you'd have the company's best interest at heart." She told him things were bad, but to pick one terminated employee, the one he absolutely had to keep, and just tell them it was all a misunderstanding. When the plane of TSR finally hit that mountain, she was adamant that, when the dust settled, that the remaining employees at TSR needed to be taken care of with either new roles or severance packages to help them move on. I'm going to be frank and honest about her screw-ups, as you're about to see, but she is not the villain she's been painted as. This is definitely not her vindication. She does, in the end, need to own her actions and her mistakes. But this is not her crucifixion either. Let's start with a blunder right out of the gate, though, the previously mentioned Dragonlance. This work, by Tracy Hickman, co-creator of the fan-favorite Ravenloft, and Margaret Weiss, who worked in TSR's book department, was a big hit in both novel form and in game form. The pair came up with their next project, Dark Sword, one word, just like Dragonlance was. Despite the success of Dragonlance, New York Times bestsellers all, TSR passed on Dark Sword. Well, if you have a trio of bestsellers, it's easy to get an agent to go hunting elsewhere, and he soon called her with the news. Bantam is interested. In fact, they're prepared to sign you right now for the whole Dark Sword trilogy. Weiss was thrilled at that, and the agent said, "And they're offering you $30,000. Today, that's more than $88,000. Now, she was plain over the moon at that. $10,000 a book is way more than TSR is paying us. And the agent clarified, no, not $30,000 for the trilogy, $30,000 per book. She wasn't even making $30,000 a year working at TSR. It was that moment that Weiss realized they were settling by continuing to work for TSR when they could be getting more money and recognition outside of the company. By passing on the Dark Sword, TSR had unwittingly allowed their talent to realize they could do so much better on the open market. What's more, the artist, Larry Elmore, who asked if Weiss might bring up his name with Bantam for the cover, not only got that job, but went on to greener pastures as well, thanks to more mainstream exposure. This is a real demarcation between the Gygax era and the Williams era. In the former, people left because of Gygax's personality. In the latter, people left because Williams failed to recognize how important it was to hold on to talent. TSR was a doorway through which the talented could pay their dues, come to recognition, and then depart. In the aforementioned Moneyball, the author speaks of the tricks that the Oakland A's used to get undervalued players, to grab unrecognized talent, utilize it for maximum gain, and when they became free agents, let them go. They even strategized such moves like selling the closer in order to profit off that. Now, TSR was essentially using the same strategy, but with one overall flaw. If Billy Beane could have kept his talent from leaving for a 20% raise and a pat on the back, he would have. Williams and her team were content to let the talent walk away, banking on finding more. The people that they got were those who were passionate, though. Lorraine kept TSR in Lake Geneva, likely for financial reasons, which meant that in some cases, that talent that dreamed of New York skyscrapers and LA beaches needed to spend their time in the purgatory of the small-town Midwest in order to ever have a hope of entering heaven. With Greyhawk and Dragonlance abandoned by their creators, TSR's Jeff Grubb went looking for a new world for the company to set adventures in. Grubb found what he was looking for in an odd place, a freelancer named Ed Greenwood. Greenwood wrote articles which frequently involved a wizard named Elminster, who would stop by, put his feet up by the fire, and pontificate for Greenwood to write down so that the masses could hear his wisdom on various fantastical topics. Greenwood's approach gave the sense that Elminster wasn't simply a generic fantasy wizard, but came from a living world, and asked Greenwood about it. Greenwood explained, and Grubb knew this was it, and a deal was struck. $4,000 for the exclusive rights to the project, $1,000 for Greenwood as a creative consultant, a new Macintosh computer, and the promise to publish Greenwood's novels. He would write 35 for TSR. The place was created as a setting for Greenwood's fiction back in the mid-60s, a place where the myths and legends of the world were real. The assertion was that we had just forgotten they were there, and hence they were called the Forgotten Realms. When he discovered D&D in those early days of TSR, he adapted the Forgotten Realms into a series of adventure settings for his groups, and later tapped into it when he was doing his freelance writing. Now he dumped 2 decades worth of material on Grubb, and while the work was rough, there was so much detail to it. At Grubb's prompting, a map composed of either 24 or 55, there are discrepancies here, 24 or 45 sheets of paper arrived, and Grubb taped it together and put this massive map on his wall. The Forgotten Realms was exactly what they were looking for, a rich, creative setting they could release for AD&D and that they could set adventures in. Oh yes, I said AD&D. You'll recall I said Queen Williams detested poachers? I mean she hated when people hunted the Queen's land, or rather, when other people were profiting off of her IP. TSR was notorious for its lawsuits, some before, but many during her run certainly, to the point the company was nicknamed They Sue Regularly. She is reported to have hinted at a lawsuit against Weiss and Hickman over a novel series, Rose of the Prophet, though it never materialized. This dislike of needing to pay others cuts to the core of a point brought up earlier about Arneson's Blackmore modules that she canceled after taking over. As Arneson noted, there was no sales reason to do so. The sales he was getting were just fine, as showed by the checks he was getting, and that just answered the question. This contributed to the theories that she wanted to shut out Gygax's friends, which hardly includes Arneson. No, Williams just hated IP that she did not have control over. Unlike Greyhawk and Dragonlance, Blackmore was never TSR's property. Even if it was profitable, she didn't want to expend resources on it. And she kept the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons name for a similar reason, only using Dungeons & Dragons often enough to keep the trademark, so that they wouldn't have to send as many checks out to Gygax and Arneson. John Danovich, a recognized veteran of RPG and tabletop gaming, was on marketing and pleaded with Williams that it was Dungeons & Dragons that everybody was familiar with. The same thing that warded off lawyers warded off new customers. They were curious about D&D, not ready to plunge into clearly the far more complicated Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They were being ridiculous, he insisted. It was as if Coca-Cola had started producing Coke Perfection and abandoned the name Coca-Cola. Why give up the most prominent name in the entire industry? He said, if you're so bothered, cut Arneson just one check, buy him out so you never have to pay him again, and can use the name. What does he want? 1 million? 2 million? 4 million? Doesn't matter. It will be worth it. You're going to make more back just using the damn name. But Williams wouldn't budge on that. And that was her second blow to the company's prosperity. Again, my position is not that Williams is a saint, but she is the victim of a smear campaign. She should be held to account for her actions and mistakes, but not to fictional flaws. And at the very least, her miserliness is not questionably legal, nor directed at her own staff, as it was under the Gygax and Bloom leadership. IP wasn't just a problem when it belonged to others, though. It was Williams' own biggest blind spot. Buck Rogers had returned with a vengeance at the tail end of the 70s, but it had soon after become a moldy has-been, the television robot Twiggy, an avatar of how dated the property was even in the late 80s. This one issue would lead to countless problems for the company. In 1990, TSR released Buck Rogers' XXVC, based on the AD&D rules but adapted to science fiction. It was followed by Mars in the 25th Century, Earth in the 25th Century, Luna, and The Belt, all to try to expand on this project. As Jim Ward announced, "We're going to keep making them until you buy it," which sounded more like an ultimatum than a sales pitch. In 1993, TSR even tried to shift the focus with High Adventure Cliffhangers, Buck Rogers' Adventure Game, to give it the pulp adventure themes, complete with biplanes and other early 20th century adventure elements, rather than being a half a millennium in the future. These weren't junk products, it should be noted, but they were built around a property which drew little interest. Williams' attempts to bring Buck Rogers back to make him popular like he'd been in the decade before would soon bring them a world of hurt. TSR made a deal with DC to produce comics based upon their IP. Comics, plural. This isn't a lone series like Star Wars, Micronauts, or Rom the Space Knight. They put out Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, Gamma Marauders, and Spelljammer, plus the limited series Avatar and TSR World's Annual Number 1. Elliot S. Magan was the editor, a man who famously broke into comics by writing a college essay, getting only a B+ for it, and so revising it into a script and selling it to DC to tell the story of how Oliver Queen, aka Green Arrow, would go on to run for mayor in spite of what all the other superheroes say. Magan had an inside look at what was happening and said that the line was profitable. AD&D itself was comparable to Wonder Woman as far as DC titles went. So this was a relationship that benefited both companies. DC was getting sales to boost their numbers against Marvel, and TSR was getting further exposure and money from licensing. But there was a bit of irritation on both sides with this. Magan says that DC didn't want to support the TSR properties as much as they should have been. Jeanette Kahn thought that they were poor quality comics, but really, it was basically just snobbery at work. Williams wasn't so petty, but she was rankled on one sticking point: that DC refused to make a Buck Rogers comic. It was infuriating. No one was saying it had to be bad. On the contrary, the intention was to show the IP, if it was done right, could make Buck Rogers be interesting again. It could be divested of the cheesy stench of Twiggy and reimagined for the 90s. DC wasn't interested. Out in LA, comic book scribe Stephen Grant enters the picture. Grant had a number of titles under his belt, most notably the first Punisher limited series, the series which arguably is what propelled the character from the minor leagues to stardom. Grant was working at First Comics in their dying days, along with writing tiny comics to put in Mattel toys, essentially just trying to keep the lights on. Despite being in LA, he resisted doing what a lot of comic writers do when they move out west: write for animation. As you can imagine, for a guy who wrote The Punisher, he was aiming for more mature writing and knew that he could box himself in if he went with animation. Those writers were sneered at by their colleagues and get screwed over. Grant says that typically the producers will insist on budgeting for $10,000 to $15,000 for writers per episode, only to then pay the writers between 10 and 30% of that and pocket the rest. In one of his rare moments of breaking down, he went to Steve Gerber at Sunbow. The company went under soon after. But when he was there, he met Flint Dilley, Lorraine Williams' brother. They lived in the same neighborhood and started having lunch together when Grant brought up an idea he'd been niggling over for a while now, something that would have a sizable impact on TSR's bottom line. In a bad way. Grant had been wishing to make his own comic book company. He knew a lot about the industry after all and had great ideas. He spoke about them to Dilley, and Dilley spoke about them with his sister. This was a perfect matchup. Forget about DC. If they won't make a Buck Rogers comic, we'll do it ourselves. We'll start our own comic book company with blackjack and hookers and other things that can't go into a comic that needs to bear the seal of the Comics Code Authority like DC does. They would have the freedom to do whatever they wanted. The cover of the first issue of RIP makes that abundantly clear, with lurching zombies, and it was only the first issue. Another property idea was Warhawks, an intriguing idea pursuing war criminals who had escaped into the past. Intruder would tie the books together, so they didn't have to be a shared universe to have something to hold it together. This, Dilly thought, would be more than just tapping comics when they were growing in popularity. They would be a way to create something tangible to sell to executives on creating film and television adaptations, to succeed where Gary Gygax had failed, because a comic book was essentially storyboards, something very visual that they could use to get more interest in producing TSR's work. Brad Munson, a veteran writer with experience in publishing, was brought in to help the pair formulate a business plan. It had a groundbreaking idea for how they wanted to do it, starting with no editors. Sounds crazy, right? But Grant explained, look, you need someone to edit the books, yes, but you don't need the traditional comic book editor to do that. Those guys are, at best, glorified traffic managers, and at worst, an obstacle, someone who forces creatives to bend to vanilla corporate groupthink. So don't have them. Instead, have project managers, freelancers paid by the project, conveying the creative director's expectations to the talent and following up regularly to bring the work in on schedule and ready for publication. These project managers would not only not be underfoot when people are trying to create the works that they were hired to create, but an editor's actual job is not involved. It's all the crap around it that takes up the bulk of their time, meetings and such. Have them work from home. We don't need office space for them. And as outside contractors, they reduced technical headcount, which looked great in the meetings with the banks. The plan was to compensate them well, as much as they'd have with a full-time job with benefits for the amount of work required. So nobody's getting screwed, but it would lower the cost, reduce interference, and help them look great on paper. Also, TSR was going to do 3 things that later companies would be famous for doing. One was showcasing creator-owned properties. Image Comics, big thing. The other was how the line could expand. They had their 5 titles: Warhawks, RIP, Intruder, Assassin 13, and of course, Buck Rogers. The plan was to first do a mini-series for each one. That way, if a book wasn't working out, it reached a natural endpoint and could be stopped. If it sold well enough, there would be a follow-up, in which a new character or group would be introduced, after which, if the character or group proved popular, would get their own series too. Valiant would follow a somewhat similar path years later, such as when the book Ray introduced Bloodshot, who in turn introduced Ninjak, and so on. It allowed for growth, but a controlled growth. Also, the use of miniseries meant that they could then, once the series wrapped up, collect them into a trade paperback and sell them in bookstores, something that Dark Horse would later do, and not coincidentally, was able to get made into movies despite not being the giants of comics. 300, Sin City, The Mask, Hellboy, Mystery Men, Tank Girl, Virus, R.I.P.D., 30 Days of Night, and Time Cop all made the jump to the silver screen, exactly what Dilly was hoping TSR West could do. In other words, TSR West had its finger on the pulse of the industry and the consumer to such a degree it was already doing things later companies would flourish with. With a solid and innovative approach, the banks were sold, and the new company, TSR West, was in business. Unfortunately, as Stephen Grant lamented, that's when Lake Geneva began screwing with their business plan in ways that didn't make any sense to him, especially this ridiculous notion of turning what they were doing into comic modules. What were they thinking? What Stephen Grant didn't know was that DC was very, very unhappy with the creation of TSR West. In fact, they canceled Ravenloft before the first issue even was released. The retaliation would be a bloody wound that might very well have contributed to the company's fate in the long run. Their lawyers got involved, that going into direct competition with them was, in some way, a violation of their publishing agreements, and was just looking for how best to sue TSR. So the upper management in Lake Geneva hit upon a legal solution that sounds brilliant, but would not survive in the real world. The idea was that TSR West did not produce comic books, they produced comic modules. What is a comic module? Very good question. They decided to create a legal definition for one. It boils down to this, though. It's a comic book with a game based upon it built inside. Essentially, these were gaming products which just happened to have a comic book story in them. Great, said the suits, who were pleased at finding their way through the minefield. Huh, said everyone else who was involved. To add the modules, Mike Cook tapped Scott Herring. Herring wasn't a native of Wisconsin. He'd moved to Lake Geneva for the chance to make games. So Cook told him he'd have a chance to do that for TSR West. He'd get to live out in sunny LA, and they'd pay him for his move, and it seemed like a chance to move up in the company if this worked out. Of course, there was the chance that it wouldn't, but Jim Ward, Gygax's friend discovered in a bookstore, remember, had been rehired by the company and said that if TSR West went belly up, as far as Ward was concerned, Herring could come back to Lake Geneva. So Scott Herring joined in by creating multiple games every month. Every comic needed something, adapting a character for D&D, for instance. But others used cards and dice as an actual game. There were problems at every level with TSR West. First was the fact that almost immediately, word came from Lake Geneva that, while in theory the trio of Dilly, Grant, and Munson were equals, in practice this was Flint Dilly's operation. He was at the top. Then there was the problem with talent. There were a lot of great comic book writers on the West Coast, and many were tapped for this, like Steve Gerber, Marv Wolfman, Buzz Dixon, and Roy Thomas. But artists, that was the problem. Frank Miller did a little bit as a favor to Dilly, but he wasn't going to do an entire book for him. So there was a lot of mediocre talent in the art department, which is a big problem because a poor artist can ruin a book more than a bad writer, sadly. If this period proved anything, after all, it was that even terrible books drawn with style could sell well. But they had the opposite problem: talented writers with horrible art. They also lacked, and whoever really thinks about this job, but it's important, letterers. Someone to put all those words on the page and make them look good. They had a great plan, but they hadn't made sure they had enough talent available to meet the needs of TSR West. And then there was distribution and sales. It was years from now that comic store owners would pivot to include gaming in their stores. They were just comic shops, especially with the limited space that their tiny brick-and-mortar shops had to work with. Comic shop owners were thus disinclined to take a product confusingly called a comic module that came from a known game company and invest money and space on what sounded like some kind of a game. For the experienced, they were risk-averse at the monetary risk. For the inexperienced, this was a time when everyone and their cousin could start a comic shop. These weren't comics, the reason they started in the first place. But a book like R.I.P. with zombies on the cover is best sent to a comic shop. It's not going to be placed on the magazine stand in the Piggly Wiggly or 7-Eleven for kids to casually ask their moms to buy. What further hampered them was that it was decided to use Random House, their book publisher, to distribute their comic modules. Except when TSR products from TSR's distributor showed up and were called the inexplicable comic module, stores would put them with games like AD&D, not with comic books. Finally, there was the lack of anything D&D related. Those properties were all tied up with DC. So despite TSR owning and being synonymous with Dungeons & Dragons, their own comic book line didn't have Dungeons & Dragons comics. The thing that would have made their comic modules sitting next to TSR's game modules in stores attract more customers didn't exist. But what was, without a doubt, the single biggest blunder was the reaction to their audience. Not by their audience, to their audience. Probably the most frequently misunderstood maxim related to business is, the customer is always right. It's mostly trotted out by customers to justify why, despite being completely unreasonable, their demands should be carried out. In reality, it's simply the idea that you treat your customers with respect, and that especially includes listening to what they want, that they know better than you what they're looking for from a product. This is where TSR West completely failed. Customer feedback was that they hated the way the modules were being executed in the books, because it required you to cut everything out of the book. Leaving aside the pain in the ass that this was just for the chance to play this small game once or twice, remember, These are comic books at the height of their popularity, when being boarded and bagged was the standard. Suggesting to a comic book fan that they'd take a scissors to their books was tantamount to telling a wine connoisseur that their 30-month aged Chianti is intended to be dumped into a pan to poach fish. The response was an editorial by Flint Dille in Intruder number 3, where he publicly showed TSR West had completely failed to get the point. Remember now, these customers are the ones who like the product, despite being hard to obtain, often not present in comic shops, frequently poorly drawn and lettered, and not containing any IP except Buck Rogers, which at this time might as well have been My Favorite Martian. They were very clear about what it was about the product that they, the ones who were willing to accept all of that, felt was too great a problem. Rather than acknowledging that their paying customers were the kind of people who were nervous about touching comic books with their hands, never mind a pair of scissors, Flint Dille doubled down on the idea. In fact, he said, "These books aren't meant for collectors. They're meant to be mauled. Our goal is to see our books return to their natural state, shredded pulp. Just call it our little contribution to ecology." The editorial was worse than ignoring the problem would have been. At least that would imply they didn't know how the audience felt, that they were going forward ignorant of their wishes. What Flint Dille did was make abundantly clear that they know what their audience wants and believes they're the ones who are in the wrong, not TSR. There are, of course, plenty of times when the audience or customers may not be right. The previously mentioned change to the film Major League comes to mind, where it's down to differences in taste. But we're not talking about a character or a plot line that they disapprove of, but a fundamental difference between what the audience wants from a product and what the publisher intends to give them. And coming right out and telling some customers that they are, in fact, not the intended customer, these books aren't meant for collectors, was practically a slap in the face, is nothing short of arrogant folly. And it should be noted, these books bore a cover price almost twice that of a mainstream book. What kind of customer were they looking for that would spend $3 on a comic when the average at the time was between $1 and $1.50, with the specific intention of seeing it destroyed? They were suggesting that rather than buying a Todd McFarlane Spider-Man and a Jim Lee X-Men to read and preserve, they instead buy a single book that came from this company and then destroy it. Instead of listening to or quietly ignoring their customers' explanations, Flint Dille unwittingly and idiotically told them to stop buying his books. Of all the mistakes made in comics, one of the most legendary should definitely be when the head of a comic book company, struggling to find an audience, so stupidly told his audience to leave if they don't like it. And why wouldn't they? The one and only IP that TSR West had was Buck Rogers, and the point of the exercise wasn't to exploit that, but to try to make it relevant again. There was no reason not to walk away, no chance that Wolverine or Batman were going to make an appearance, no decades of history that it was part of. All TSR West had going for it was some name recognition for some of its creators. Stephen Grant was watching TSR completely screwing up the carefully laid out plans, and after the meeting with Random House to launch TSR West's comic book line, he already knew their efforts were doomed. This company was going to go under. He was certain of it. He announced that in December 1989, he'd be leaving the company's management. Except the IP on which his comics were based was his own, not TSR's. So with no reason to remain with the company, this IP's future was now in question. TSR could lose it. Of course, Grant knew he had nothing of any real value there, and he figured he'd just sell those properties to TSR. He was mulling over how much to ask when a letter arrived from TSR, an ultimatum. It demanded that he sell those properties to them, and that if he refused, they were going to sue him. He was aghast, unable to believe the naked hostility of the move, putting a gun loaded with lawyers to his temple and demanding he sign away his property. Who did they think they were? It was then that he saw the check. It was ridiculously large, completely beyond the value of the properties involved. He happily signed it and left a clueless management in place, one that now had no experience with the comics industry. Grant would have stopped Dille from stupidly insulting their tiny audience, that's for certain. Elliot S. Magan, the editor of D&D's comics at DC, came to TSR West hoping that it would be a chance to move from comics into film and television, like so many of the former comic writers. However, despite his experience in moving him and his ex-wife and son out to LA, they didn't make him a salaried employee, they kept him a freelancer. Unlike those like Gerber and Wolfman, he didn't have this as a side job. He was hoping to fully commit to TSR West, and they were now without anyone at the top who had any experience with comics. Yet before taking him on board, they wanted to try him out first, keep him on for a few months to see if he might be a good idea. TSR and Lorraine Williams' era had a habit of having extremely talented people drop out of the sky and into their laps and would act as if that were an everyday occurrence, that you could act as if you could just hire another member of the sales team. What's more, Comic Modules did not placate DC. When the license expired, they did not renew. Value be damned, they would not put money in the coffers of a company that had decided to start direct competition with them. All the move Comic Modules did was contribute to the failure of TSR West. Megan tells of how one day the suits from Lake Geneva arrived and fired everyone except for him. He would remain as editor-in-chief. Yes, by himself. A rather interesting development for a man who broke into comics writing a story, What Can One Man Do? Now trapped in this office all by himself, having to answer, What can one man do? This lasted 4 more months before they shuttered TSR West completely. The suits returned, handed him a pathetic severance check, and told Magan he was done. They wouldn't even allow him to retrieve his personal contact information off his computer, though he had a secret weapon there, his ex-wife. Now no longer his ex, they had remarried a couple years earlier and remained together for another 20 years. She came in, carrying the baby she had just delivered 9 days earlier, carefully put the child down, and proceeded to read them the Riot Act, along with all associated gloss and commentaries, until, finally, they acquiesced and let him get his data. He also formatted the hard drive. Not to destroy anything, it just sounded like something fun to do on his last day. Despite things, Megan had no ill will towards Lorraine Williams. While she is ultimately responsible for everything and the ill-advised decision that undermined the company came from Lake Geneva, nevertheless, he just thinks some bad decisions were made, but that there was a kind of logic to them. It was just that together, those bad decisions destroyed the company from day one, as Stephen Grant could see, and as poor Scott Herring had feared. In the years since his departure, things had deteriorated. Ward tried to bring him back, but Mike Cook, who had personally assured them that it would be done if TSR West failed, went back on his word. I just can't do it, he said with dismay. Herring was left doing freelance work and driving shuttle buses to make ends meet now. In retrospect, TSR West was sunk for 3 reasons: the deal with DC, interference from Lake Geneva, and a lack of preparation to bring in the talent that was needed. But it was otherwise a good idea of how to expand TSR in a way that fit their core business. Rather than going into crafts, raising sunken ships, and other frivolous things, it was a sound plan. I don't want to seem like an apologist because the debt from this endeavor would severely impact the company. Much of what is to come has to have been, at best, worsened by this endeavor. Arguably, it could have been called a mortal blow. I just feel it's worth mentioning, given the animosity that is unwilling to give her even an inch, that we call this what it is: a failure. But unlike under the Blooms and Gygax, not a ridiculous, frivolous failure. At the same time, though, being compared to the reign of the Blooms and Gygax is hardly complimentary. Yes, this wasn't the gibbering, blithering stupidity that we expected their TSR to get up to, but that's a low bar to contend with. Williams was the grown-up in the room, but a grown-up with some blind spots. She did quite well considering she didn't have a business background, but she was making mistakes the company couldn't afford for her to make, especially as the industry was stretching and straining as time passed. We'll see more of this when we get to the second part of our tale.